I'm Bob McCann with Gold Associates. We're an international company, about 7,000 folks worldwide, dealing in the US, Canada, Europe, and Asia, as well as South America and Africa. Part of our job is to deal with environmental issues, dealing with projects that are from manufacturing, chemical, power plants, mining, as well as other industries, to ensure that whatever the emissions are in terms of estimates, we look at in terms of controls and air quality standards and applicable health criteria. So one of the things that we were tasked to do for this particular project was to review the proposed air quality controls, make some recommendations, and then also evaluate those emissions together with the state of Georgia to make sure that they are up to standards for the type of facility this is. We also did some evaluation in terms of air quality impacts, in terms of air toxics, cancer-causing agents, that sort of thing, based on the Georgia Environmental Protection Division's criteria for evaluating those type of compounds. As I mentioned, Georgia EPD actually did issue the permit in July of this year, and that was after a detailed review of a draft permit that was evaluated back in April. For this type of facility, normally the emissions are looked at, the controls are evaluated, as well as the assessment of air quality impacts. And many times for a facility like this, that's not necessarily done. As I'll explain in a minute, this is considered a minor source of air pollutants. And what's been presented for this particular project is extensive controls to make sure that those emissions are going to be at low enough levels to not affect the air quality. The application was actually submitted last December. For a source like this, normally if you submit something in a time period, it's about a 3-month review cycle for the agency to look at the emissions, look at the controls, and maybe the air quality impacts. It took about nearly 7 months for that evaluation. There was extensive review from April through June and July of this year that the agency reviewed the work that we performed, agreed with it, and then issued the permit. Just want to go over some of the controls that Gil had mentioned earlier, give some numbers to those. In terms of the emission controls, we are looking at the fabric filter bag house that's capturing a lot of the particulates. I have up there PM10, it's also capturing some of the PM2.5. We have call it a dry scrubber or a sorbent injection system that's controlling sulfur dioxide emissions and acid gases, one of those being hydrogen chloride, or HCl. Gil also mentioned about the NOx, or nitrogen oxide reductions. That's a huge concern these days with the ambient standards. In terms of what's been happening with health standards in the US, they've actually been lowered. This facility will meet and be well below those particular standards. And lastly, there will also be an oxidation catalyst that will control carbon monoxide as well as volatile organic compounds, which are made up of a bunch of different volatiles that can be carcinogen and that sort of thing, and it's going to actually have that sort of control to make the emissions much lower. And that's really for the stack emissions. Because of the other operations around the facility, excuse me, there's a biomass handling system. There will be controls to handle the fugitive dust that's going to occur. There are cyclones, water sprays. For ash handling system, there's also be another bag house. And even for the cooling tower, there'll also be some additional controls. Now, in terms of the permit, what was issued by Georgia EPD, again, this was considered a minor source by the agency. That is because the controls are in place, the levels are so low that it's being evaluated a little bit different than if it were considered a major source. And even if it were a major source, these levels of controls are the same levels that would be placed on it. Their emission limits are established that the facility has to meet for SO2, NO2, PM, particulate matter, and carbon monoxide. There's also a criteria to look at formaldehyde, benzene, hydrogen chloride, really as triggers for other pollutants. They're really surrogates. So if these are the main pollutants that are being emitted, then other pollutants are going to be at a much lower level. They have to meet those particular limits. And the same for mercury. Mercury has to have a test to ensure that it's below a certain level. With that, there's monitoring requirements that's going to be conducted either continuously or at least once a year for all of those pollutants. And in particular, there will be a PM or opacity, that is a visible plume measurement being made to ensure that it's going to stay below a certain level. And as Gil mentioned, you're not going to see the plume from this particular facility. I mentioned a little bit earlier about the air quality criteria, and there's a bunch of standards out there established by the US EPA and followed by the Georgia EPD, and they're health standards. And what we evaluate is to make sure that the facility that we deal with is going to meet those standards. And this facility will meet that because of the controls. And one of the examples that we looked at was for PM 2.5, which is a big concern. It's about 1% of the ambient air quality standards, a very low mark indeed. The other areas that the Georgia evaluates are for air toxic emissions, and they're considered AACs or acceptable ambient concentration levels. And these are levels that Georgia has established based on health criteria set up by the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health organization and other organizations to ensure that the air quality from air toxics or hazardous air pollutants will be less than the levels presented. And what we found is that for this facility, we estimated that the facility impact would be a factor of 10 to 100 times or greater. In fact, most of the impacts were 3 orders of magnitude less than the AACs established by EPA. One note to make is when we do our evaluation, excuse me, we look at the, we call them receptors, or places where we locate potential points around a facility to establish the maximum impact. And when I talk about these particular impacts, it's generally at a point that's fairly close to the facility. All other areas are going to be much lower than that maximum point. And we looked at over about 5 years worth of meteorological data, pretty standard. That's about 9,000 combinations of weather conditions to determine what would be the maximum impact. And again, we found the impacts to be really low. So in summary, really, excuse me, in terms of what we see from what the regulations provide and what we see from the actual impact we expect, this really is the minor source, which will comply and has to comply with emission limits and will comply with ambient health standards and guidelines. This is not based just on our review, but it's also based on what Georgia EPD conducted independently of what we provided as a double check on what we presented. So we believe that the issuance of the construction permit, again, it's already been issued, was done in a reasonable manner by Georgia EPD. They certainly gave enough input in terms of questioning what the conditions were and that sort of thing, and then finalized really the conditions as I mentioned earlier. And that concludes my summary.